In the next few videos, we're going to explore user permissions in Django applications, and we're also going to take a look at the Django Guardian package. This is a popular package for object level permissions in Django. Now, I was originally making this video only on Django Guardian, and that is going to be coming up next, but I realised that it would be useful to do an introductory video to Django's permission system, and that's the permission system that's built into the framework natively. So by the end of this video, you should understand the built-in permissions framework in Django, and that's going to help you build role-based or permission-based applications. So let's get into it. Before we do, if you want to support the channel, check out the Ko-fi page we've got linked just below the video. And if you're enjoying this content, consider becoming a member of the channel. And thank you very much to everyone who has joined so far. And don't forget to like and subscribe as well. So let's start our overview of the built-in permissions in Django. And to do so, we need to look at the models that are part of the Django.contrib.auth package. So I've made a couple of slides for this, and these are very simple. It's only going to take a second to go through these. So let's start with these core models that are built into the auth package. And you're probably familiar with the user model, and that represents a single user entity in the application, and that can be used to store the username and password, as well as other details such as email addresses and whether the user is active and so on. And in terms of permissions, you can assign permissions directly to users. So if you have user X and user Y, each user can have their own set of permissions, and that's one way of applying permissions in Django. Now we also have the group model built into the auth package, and that allows you to organize users into collections or groups, as the name implies. So you have the relationship in the database here that a group has users, and you can add multiple users to the same group. And groups also have permissions, and the users that are part of the group are going to inherit the permissions of the group. So examples of groups might be editors, moderators, managers, and so on. You would assign users to these groups, and any permissions associated with the group are going to be inherited by the user. Now let's come to the final model I want to highlight here, and that's the permission model that's built into Django. Now permissions represent actions that a user can perform, and let's say you have a document model in the application, and that has a table under the hood in the database. You might have permissions such as add document, and that is a permission that would allow users to add documents if they have that permission, or change document, view document, and so on. So these permissions can be assigned directly to users or to groups, as we've just described a second ago. And Django creates 4 permissions for every model by default, and that's a view, add, change, and delete permission for each model that's installed in your Django application. And by default, users are not assigned any permissions. So that permission system is in place, but you need to then assign permissions to users in order to actually use that. And we're going to see how to do that in this video. And one final caveat here, if you create a super user in Django, the super user bypasses all permission checks. So that's an overview of the core models in the Django auth package, the user model, the group model, and the permission model. And we're going to see how those map to database entities very soon in this video. Now I want to work with the document model in this video, so what I'm going to do is open VS Code, and in this application we have a single model called document, and it's got those fields as you can see here. Now in Django's normal permission system, the permissions are applied at the model level, so you can attach a permission such as add document, but that is applied across the entire set of documents that you have in that table. You cannot do object level permissions with Django alone, unless you implement your own system. So what do I mean when I say that permissions are applied at the model level? Well, if you imagine that a user has a view document permission, that means if you use that permission, they can view any document across the entire system. And we can reference the Django documentation here under permissions and authorization, and I'll leave a link to this below the video. If we scroll down here, we can see the default permissions that are added in Django. So when you have Django.contrib.auth in installed apps, that's going to ensure the 4 default permissions for add, change, delete, and view are created for each Django model defined in your application. And the permissions are created when you run manage.py migrate. And you can see below, if you have a user model instance and you want to check if that user has a permission, you can use the has_perm function, and you pass in the name of the permission as an argument, and that's going to return true or false depending on whether the user has that permission. Now this function here and this permission checking that's built in is very useful, but one thing it doesn't allow you to do is check at the object level, and that's where Django Guardian comes in, and we're going to take a deep dive into that in the next video once we understand the built-in permission system. And just as a flavour for what's to come, Let's say we have this document model, and if you've ever used something like Google Docs, you can share that document with specific people. Now that is an object level permission in a way, because you have a single document that you want to share with user X or user Y. In order to actually do that, you can't give that user access to all the documents that you have. So there needs to be more granularity than what's built into Django by default, and that's something that Django Guardian can enable if you're using that in your application. But for now, let's explore the built-in permissions, and here we have this document model. What I want to do to start with is have a look at the database, and we can see what's actually created in Django for the permission system. Now, we mentioned the core models built into the auth package, the group model, the permission model, and the user model. If we have a look at the permission table here, I'm going to view the data in that, and you can see the data that's added when you run the migrate command for the first time. So for every single model in our application, there is an add, change, delete, and view permission added to this table. And each permission is tied to a parent model via the content type ID. So let's say for ID 1, what we can do to find out what that is go to the Django content type table, and you can see that ID represents the admin application and the log entry model. Now, one thing we added was this document model, and that's in the core application. If we go back to the permission table here, let's view this. And we're going to find this model in this table. So you can see the first record here in line 25, that's the add document permission. And we also have change document, delete document, and view document. So Django creates these 4 permissions for every single model in your application. And if you need any additional permissions on top of these 4, you can add those. And we're going to see an example of that later on. But in order to do that, you would use the meta class inside your model, and you would define the extra permissions. We'll see more about that later on. Now, one important thing to know by default is that these permissions are created, but they're not attached to any users. That's the job of an administrator. So if we go to the user permissions table, this is a junction table that links a user ID and a permission ID, and that allows a user to have many permissions, and it also allows a permission to be tied to many users. But there's no data in this table by default, so no permissions are created. That is the responsibility of whoever's in charge of your website or admins, for example. At the moment, all we have is a permissions table that actually contains a set of permissions, but they're not applied at the moment. Now, what I want to do is look at the view document permission, and we're going to look at a practical example here of how we can restrict access to only users that have that permission. And we're going to use a decorator called permission required in order to do that. But for now, I want to have a very quick look at this application. So we have the Django server running. I'm going to go to localhost 8000. And if we go to /documents here, we can get this super basic page here. We have a header saying documents, and we have 2 documents in the database. One's called Introduction to Python, and the other is Introduction to TypeScript. And we also have a very simple login and logout system using Django AllAuth. And when we click one of these documents, we are taken to the document detail page. And that's where we can see more information about the document based on this ID in the URL. So this is standard Django stuff. If we go to urls.py, we have the 2 paths here, one for /documents and then one for /documents/ID. And these map to a document list and document detail view. So let's go to views.py, and here we can see the default views. In the document list page, we just fetch all of the documents and we return them as part of this template. And in the detail view, we use getObject or 404, and we fetch a document by the ID in the URL, and then add that to the context and make it available in documentdetail.html. Now, at the moment, this is open to anybody that's logged in because we have the login required decorator on these pages. But if you are logged in, you can access all documents. So there are no permission-based restrictions on this page at all. We just fetch all of the documents and they are then viewable for the user. But let's say that we have very strict requirements in our application, and only users that have the view document permission can actually view this page and look at the documents. Now, one way to do this is to use a similar decorator to login required. And we're going to go to the top here and we're going to import permission required from the auth.decorators module. And then underneath login required, we can add this, and it's important to do this underneath login required. So we can add the permission required decorator, and then the name of the permission here. It's in the core application and it's the view_document permission. And we can use raise exception as true as a keyword argument here. And that means if the user who's trying to access this page does not have this permission, it's going to raise that 403 forbidden exception. So we're going to test this out, but before we do, I want to go to the Django admin here, And we're going to have a look at the users that we have in this application. So we have a user called 𝗏𝗡𝗊𝗋, and you can see that that user is a super user, and it's got the staff status set to true. And that's who I'm logged in as at the moment. And we also have John Doe, who is not a super user. Now, because I'm logged in as a super user, if we go back to this page, I can still view the documents, because remember from earlier on, super users bypass permission checks in Django. So when this permission required decorator is running, it will check to see if the user who's sending the request is a super user. If that's the case, it's just going to return the view. So let's log in as John Doe. And when that login is successful, it redirects us to the documents page, and you can see we get the 403 forbidden response. We're no longer able to access this page, and that's because John Doe does not have this permission here of core.viewDocument. So now we cannot access this page. So this is an example of how you can use a permission in Django to restrict access to an entire view. You can use the permission required decorator. And if we just comment this out and go back to the application as John Doe, let's refresh this page, and this time we get the response because we're no longer checking those permissions. So if we want to give John Doe access to this page, let's bring back the decorator and go back to the application. What we need to do is somehow get John Doe the permission in order to access this page. There's two things we can do here. We can link the permission to John Doe's user directly, or the second thing we could do is create a group in the Django application and add John Doe to that group, and then assign the permission to the group so that the permission is inherited by all users, including John Doe, who are part of the group. Now we can do this in the Django admin, so let's go back to the admin page here. Now I've opened this incognito on another browser so that I can stay logged in as John Doe on the other browser. And what I'm going to do is go to John Doe, and we're going to start by adding the permissions directly to the user. So what we can do here is go down to the user permissions section, and I'm going to search for the document level permissions on that document model, and we can add the can view document permission to John Doe, and then let's go to the bottom and save this. So John Doe now has that permission. Let's go back to the application, and I'm back on the documents page we were on before. If we refresh that page, you can see we now get the response, we now get the documents, and we can now access this page. Now before we move on, I want to show how this looks in the database. So let's bring up Beekeeper Studio, and let's go back to this user permissions table that we were on before, and let's refresh the data in this table, and you can see we now have one row in the table, and that links the user ID of 2 to the permission ID of 28. So if we go to the auth permission table, the record with ID 28 is the view document permission, and in the user table, of course, we're going to find out that user number 2 is John Doe. So the way this works in this user permission table is that it links the user ID to the permission ID, and that gives you a very flexible system where a user can have any number of permissions, and a permission can be used by any number of users. Now let's show the second way of doing this. So let's go back to John Doe, and we're going to remove this permission from John Doe's user, and we're going to save that. Now, if we go back to John Doe again and go down to the groups section, you can see we can also add groups here, but we don't actually have any groups at the moment. So I'm going to go to the group page in the Django admin, and let's create a group here. And we can give the group a name, let's say document viewers, and we can go down to the permissions that are attached to the group. And again, I'm going to add can view document to the permissions, and let's save this. So we now have a group in the Django application. We can go back to John Doe, and let's go down to the group section and add this group to John Doe, and then we can save this at the bottom. And if we go back to the application, let's refresh this page again, and we still get the same response. We can access the documents page, and that's because John Doe is part of a group that has permission to view the documents. So what happens in the database here, let's go to Beekeeper Studio. In the user permissions table, if we refresh this, we now get no data because we removed the permission from the user directly. But we have another table we can look at here, and that's the group permissions table. And you can see now a group ID has been tied to the same permission. So this is exactly the same as the other table, but it links a group instead of a user to the permission. And the link between the user and the group is captured in this table here, auth user groups. So let's view the data in there. And this time user ID 2, which is John Doe, is linked to group ID 1, which is the document viewer group. Now I want to highlight something here. Any number of users can be added to group ID 1, so you could have 10,000 users in this group, and that allows easier permission management than working at the user level. So often permissions are going to overlap, and using a group saves a lot of management and maintenance effort. And that's because you can add the set of permissions one time to the group, and if anything needs to change, you can just change the group once. instead of having to do that for the 10,000 users. So if you have these role-based applications or group-based applications, it's much better to manage the users inside these groups than try and attach permissions directly. Now I'm going to go back to John Doe here, and I'm going to remove this group, and we're going to save the user. So we're essentially going back to the default state. John Doe no longer has any permissions. And if we go back to this page, we get the same 403 response. What I want to demonstrate now is how we can actually assign permissions, not through the Django admin, but using Python and doing this programmatically. So let's go back to VS Code, and what I'm going to do is stop the server at the bottom, and we're going to run shell plus because I have Django extensions installed, and I'm going to show some queries in the terminal at the bottom here. So let's fetch the user from the database. User.objects.last is going to give us John Doe, and we can check programmatically what permissions John Doe has using the user permissions manager, and we can then call .all, and as you can see at the moment, John Doe does not have any permissions. But we can use the Django permission model to fetch a permission from the database. So here I'm executing a query permission.objects.get, and we're getting the permission with the code name of view document. So that gives us back a permission model instance. And if you're familiar with Django's many-to-many manager, you can call .all and .filter as normal, but you can also use methods such as .add, .remove, and .clear to manage the objects that are tied to the user. So if we bring back .all here, I'm going to change that to .add, and we can then pass the permission instance into that. And then if we re-execute user.userpermissions.all, you can see we now get a query set that contains that single permission. So we programmatically added the permission to the user. And just like using .add at the bottom here, we can call .remove to remove a single permission from the user. Now I think typically permissions are going to be managed using the Django admin or some kind of interface. But if you're doing any kind of automation or management commands for permission-based work, you might want to use the permission model directly. Now there's a few final things I want to show in this video. At the moment we're using permission required, and that's going to block the user from accessing this page unless they have this permission. But what if we wanted to do this on a more granular level? For example, there might be a section of a page that you want to only expose to certain users, but you don't want to block the entire loading of the page for anyone that doesn't have that permission. So you can do this in a more granular level. So let's comment out the decorator for now and go to the view itself. And what we can do is use that has permission function we saw near the start of the video. So we're going to take request.user, and because we have login required, that is going to be an authenticated Django user object. And we can then call that function hasPerm, and we can pass in the core.viewDocument permission. So core.viewDocument is the permission we are checking, and hasPerm is going to return true or false based on whether the user has that permission or not. And we can return a response if that's the case. So at the top here from Django.http, I'm going to import HTTP response forbidden, and we can return that inside this if statement alongside a message here of you cannot view documents. Now I've made a big mistake here, of course. We should be negating this because we only want to return the forbidden response if the user does not have this permission. So the hasPerm function will return true or false based on whether the user has this permission. And only if the user does not have the permission do we want to return this response. So let's save this and go back to our application. And when we refresh the page, we get this response, you cannot view documents. And that means that we have received this response here because we do not have the permission. Now what we're doing at the moment has a similar effect to the permission required decorator. But a more granular use case would be to imagine that you have a page that's open to all authenticated users, but there's a section of the page that's only available to users with the view document permission. So I'm going to remove this code here, and let's just show a dummy example of this. So when we define the context, we add documents, but let's say we had some conditional context, and we check if the user has the permission of core view document, and then we add something to the context only if they have that permission. So in this case, a key called special report, and then we have a value here. So that's a more granular use case for permissions. We don't limit access to the entire view, but only to a section of context or maybe a section of the template. So depending on what you actually want to do here with the permissions, you can use either of these methods. But again, these are applied across the entire model for the document. We'll see in the next video how we can limit access to specific documents using Django Guardian. Now one last thing I want to look at in this video is how to add custom permissions. Before we do so, if you found this content useful, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already done so. And if you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page, it's linked below the video, and consider becoming a member as well, it would be greatly appreciated. and thank you very much to everyone who has joined the channel. So in order to look at custom permissions, what we're going to do is go to models.py, where we have our document model. And what we can add here is a meta class. And a meta class is a convention in Django. It adds additional metadata to the model, and you can use that for many different purposes. One of them is to add extra permissions using the permissions key here, which we set to a list. Now I'm going to add 3 permissions for documents here, so I'm going to tab these over. We have publish document, archive document, and share document. Now of course you can imagine a share document permission will allow you to share the document with other users, and same for archiving documents and publishing documents to the platform. These are slightly different than the ones that are built in, for example, to view a document. So these are different actions you might want to perform on the model. Now each element of the permissions list is a tuple that contains 2 elements. The first element of this is a code name for the permission, and the second is a human readable name for the permission. And it's important to also note that Django will still create the 4 default permissions in the permission table. These are additional permissions that are going to be added on top of those. So let's try this out by saving models.py and going back to the terminal here. And we're going to clear this out, and we're going to run python manage.py make migrations. And when we run make migrations, it's going to add that new migration file. And then if we clear this out and run the migrate command, it's going to add the new permissions into the database. So let's go back to Beekeeper Studio, and we're going to take a look at the permission table. And at the bottom, you can see we have the new permissions added for publish, archive, and share document. And that code name, which was the first element of the tuple, has been added in that column. And the second element of the tuple for each one of those was the human readable name, and that goes into the name column of the permission table. So that's how easy it is to extend the 4 default permissions that are added for your models in the Django application. And you can extend those for specific workflows and specific functionality that you might have in your Django project. For example, for a document, you might want to publish that or archive it or share it. These are just some examples. Now in the next video, we're going to explore Django Guardian, and we're going to look at the ability to apply permissions not only to entire models, but to individual objects within a table. So for example, if I go to the document table here, we have 2 documents, and these have titles of Introduction to Python and TypeScript. Now let's say I only wanted to give a user access to Introduction to Python. That's not really possible at the moment with the Django permission system without implementing our own checks. And that's because this level of granularity at the object level is not supported by the built-in Django permission system. So in order to implement that, we can use Django Guardian. And this is a well-tested and well-used package for Django. As you can see on GitHub, it's got nearly 4,000 stars. And you can see its features here. It has object permissions for Django and anonymous user support, and some admin integration and decorators. So we're going to look at that in the next video. And by having object level permissions, you can unlock functionality such as assigning tasks to an individual user, or sharing a document with specific people only, or allowing moderators, for example, to manage content in one category but not in others. So we'll move on to that in the next video. This video has been an overview of Django's permission system, and we've looked at key concepts such as the permission required decorator and also the user.hasPermission function. And we saw the structure of database tables and how users can be linked to permissions and groups can be linked to permissions as well. And we saw that users that are part of a group will inherit the permissions of that group. So I hope you learned something in this video. If you found it useful and you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page that we've got just below the video. And if you want to become a member and support the channel, you can join the channel just below the video as well. And thanks very much to everybody who has done so. It's greatly appreciated and it helps keep this content free on YouTube. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video on Django Guardian.